For years, France trusted in a wall, a massive wall of steel, concrete, and heavy artillery. They called it the Maginot Line, and they considered it invincible. The pride of French military engineering, and their greatest strategic gamble. The generals believed no enemy force could breach it. None. But in the spring of 1940, while French soldiers gazed confidently eastward, the enemy was moving somewhere else, through terrain that France had completely dismissed, a region they considered impossible to traverse with tanks. And when the news arrived, it didn't come through the bunkers of the Maginot, but through the offices of the High Command. The Germans had crossed the Ardennes, and the Maginot Line was worthless. That was the instant, cold, silent, irreversible, when France understood that their entire military doctrine had failed.
November 11th, 1918. The guns finally fell silent across the Western Front. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had ended. 10 million dead, an entire generation of young Frenchmen buried in the muddy fields of Verdun, the Somme, the Marne. France had survived, barely, but the victory tasted of ash and blood. The French military establishment looked at the devastated landscape of their country and made a vow: never again. Never again would German armies march across French soil. Never again would French cities burn. Never again would the nation face annihilation. But how to prevent it? The answer seemed obvious. The Great War had proven one fundamental truth: defense dominated offense. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery had turned the battlefield into a meat grinder. Attackers died by the thousands trying to advance mere yards. If defense was supreme, then France would build the ultimate defense. In 1929, Minister of War André Maginot proposed an audacious plan: a fortified line stretching from Switzerland to Belgium, an impregnable barrier that would make another invasion impossible. The French Parliament, still haunted by memories of German occupation, approved the plan enthusiastically. Construction began in 1930. What emerged over the next decade was nothing short of extraordinary. The Maginot Line wasn't just a wall, it was an underground fortress city. Massive concrete casements housing 75mm and 135mm guns. Retractable turrets that could rise from the earth to fire, then sink back down, impervious to counter-battery fire. Underground railways connecting the forts, barracks that could house thousands of soldiers in climate-controlled comfort, power plants, ammunition depots, hospitals, everything needed to sustain a garrison for months without resupply. The engineering was magnificent. The guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no attacker could approach without facing concentrated artillery from multiple angles. Anti-tank obstacles covered the approaches. Minefields stretched for miles. Behind the main line of forts stood a second line, and behind that, mobile reserves ready to counterattack any breakthrough. French military engineers had studied every lesson from the Great War. They had built something unprecedented in military history, a defensive line that seemed mathematically impossible to defeat through direct assault.
The cost was staggering, approximately 5 billion francs, roughly 3% of France's entire GDP. But the French people believed it was worth every centime. Propaganda films showed tourists visiting the fortifications,
Newsreels depicted smiling soldiers in their underground quarters, playing cards and reading newspapers in perfect safety, while mock exercises tested the guns above. The message was clear. France was protected. The genius of French engineering had created an invincible shield. The military establishment embraced the Maginot Line with religious fervor. It became the centerpiece of French defensive doctrine. War plans assumed that any German attack would shatter against these fortifications, buying time for full mobilization and a counteroffensive once the enemy had exhausted themselves. Senior officers who had survived the trenches felt a profound sense of relief. The next war, when it came, would not require millions of young men charging into machine gun fire. The Maginot would hold. France would fight from strength, from prepared positions, using the terrain and technology to their advantage. But there was a problem. The line ended at the Belgian border. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice based on several factors. First, Belgium was a neutral nation and French ally. Fortifying the Belgian border might offend their sensibilities and push them towards Germany. Second, the terrain further north was different. The flat Belgian plain and the forested Ardennes didn't offer the same defensive advantages as the Rhine Valley. Third, and perhaps most importantly, French strategists assumed that any German invasion would come through Belgium, just as it had in 1914. France's plan was simple. When Germany inevitably violated Belgian neutrality again, French and British forces would rush forward into Belgium to meet them on terrain favorable for mobile defense. The Maginot would anchor the southern flank, forcing the Germans to attack where the Allies chose to fight. It seemed logical. It seemed foolproof. It was based entirely on assumptions about how Germany would fight the next war.
The French High Command believed they understood warfare. They had fought the greatest war in history and emerged victorious. Their generals, men like Maurice Gamelin, who became supreme commander of French forces, had survived the trenches, had seen the futility of offensive warfare against prepared defenses. They had learned the lessons of 1914 to 1918. Or so they thought. The doctrine that emerged from the Great War was called méthodique, methodical warfare. It emphasized careful preparation, overwhelming firepower, and systematic advances behind massive artillery barrages. Infantry would advance only when the way was cleared. Tanks would support infantry, not race ahead independently. The key was control, coordination, and minimizing casualties through superior firepower. It was the exact opposite of the German doctrine being developed simultaneously across the Rhine. In Germany, a new generation of military theorists, men like Heinz Guderian, were studying the same war and drawing radically different conclusions. They saw that the problem wasn't that offense had failed, but that it had been conducted wrong. Armies had become too slow, too predictable. What if instead of using tanks to support infantry, you concentrated tanks into massive armored spearheads that could punch through enemy lines and race deep into the rear areas, disrupting communications, destroying supply depots, and creating chaos? What if you could move so fast that the enemy couldn't react? This concept, Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was revolutionary. It required close coordination between tanks, motorized infantry, and aircraft. It required radios in every tank for real-time communication. It required commanders willing to accept risk and chaos in exchange for speed and shock. The French received intelligence reports about these new German theories. They dismissed them. French military doctrine held that tanks could never operate independently of infantry. The terrain wouldn't allow it. Supply lines couldn't sustain it. The risks were too great. The Germans were simply recycling old ideas about cavalry, applying them inappropriately to modern warfare. The French had the intelligence. They had the information. They chose not to believe it. In 1937, German Colonel Heinz Guderian published a book called Achtung, Panzer, outlining his theories of armored warfare. French intelligence translated it. Senior French officers read it. They concluded Guderian was a dreamer, proposing tactics that would never work in reality. France had more tanks than Germany. French tanks were, in many cases, better than German tanks. The Char B-1 was more heavily armored and more powerfully armed than anything in the German arsenal. But French tanks lacked radios. Only command tanks had them. French doctrine scattered tanks among infantry divisions rather than concentrating them. French training emphasized defensive positions rather than rapid maneuver. France had the tools to counter the German approach. They had chosen to use those tools differently.
And then there were the Ardennes. The Ardennes Forest, a densely wooded, hilly region where Belgium, Luxembourg, and France meet. The same terrain German forces had passed through in 1914, but slowly, on foot and horse, taking weeks to emerge. French strategists had studied the Ardennes carefully. Their conclusion: the terrain was unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The roads were too narrow, too winding. The forests were too dense. Tanks and motorized columns would get bottlenecked, creating perfect targets for air attacks. Any force trying to traverse the Ardennes would be channeled, slowed, vulnerable. The Ardennes were France's natural defensive barrier. They required minimal fortification because geography itself would stop any attack. This assessment appeared in official French military studies. It was taught at the École Supérieure de Guerre, where French officers learned strategy. It became accepted wisdom. The Ardennes were impenetrable to modern armored forces. Some voices dissented. In 1938, a French intelligence report noted increased German activity near the Ardennes sector. Panzer divisions were concentrating in western Germany. Training exercises seemed focused on rapid movement through difficult terrain. The report was filed away. The analysts who wrote it were thanked for their diligence. Their superiors noted that Germany naturally had to station troops somewhere, and the Ardennes sector was as good as anywhere else. It didn't mean they planned to attack there. In early 1940, Belgian intelligence officers reported unusual German reconnaissance activity in the Ardennes. German officers had been spotted surveying roads and bridges. Small units were conducting nighttime exercises in forested areas. The French High Command reviewed this intelligence during routine briefings. The response was measured. Of course, the Germans were exploring all possibilities. Professional military forces conduct reconnaissance everywhere. It didn't indicate their main effort. And besides, even if the Germans did attempt something in the Ardennes, it would take them days to push through the forests. French forces would have ample time to respond, to shift reserves, to establish blocking positions. The Ardennes might not be as secure as the Maginot Line, but they were still a formidable obstacle. The French war plan, called Plan Dial, assumed German forces would invade Belgium through the northern plains. When that happened, the 1st French Army Group, the finest units in the French military, supported by the British Expeditionary Force, would rush forward to meet them along the Dial River in central Belgium.
It would be a meeting engagement, mobile warfare on open terrain where French and British forces could leverage their numbers and equipment. The plan was elegant. It protected Belgium. It kept the fighting off French soil. It played to French strengths. It assumed the Germans would do what France expected them to do.
In October 1939, a German general named Erich von Manstein was serving as chief of staff to Army Group A. He was frustrated. The official German war plan called for a repetition of 1914, a massive assault through Belgium and the Netherlands, pushing toward Paris from the north. It was unimaginative. It was predictable. The Allies would be expecting it. Manstein proposed something audacious. Make the northern thrust a feint, a diversion to pull French and British forces forward into Belgium. Meanwhile, concentrate the bulk of German armor, 7 panzer divisions, in the Ardennes. Push through the impenetrable forest, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and then race west to the English Channel, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium from their bases in France. It was brilliant. It was risky. It required perfect timing and extraordinary aggression. Hitler loved it. Despite resistance from conservative elements in the German High Command, the plan, eventually designated as Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, was approved. Germany would gamble everything on speed, surprise, and the French conviction that the Ardennes couldn't be crossed. Through winter and early spring of 1940, German forces prepared. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps would lead the assault. Drivers practiced navigating narrow forest roads. Engineers studied bridge capacities and river crossing techniques. Luftwaffe pilots memorized the routes to make sure their dive bombers could provide support at the critical moment. The logistics were staggering. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks would have to move through the Ardennes in a coordinated stream, crossing borders simultaneously, maintaining momentum despite inevitable traffic jams and mechanical breakdowns. If the advance stalled, if the French had time to organize a defense at the Meuse River crossings, the entire operation would fail catastrophically. The Germans had studied French defensive doctrine. They knew how France would respond. Slowly, methodically, waiting for complete intelligence before committing reserves. The entire plan depended on moving faster than French decision-making processes could react. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. At dawn, German forces crossed the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg simultaneously. Paratroopers seized key bridges and fortifications. Luftwaffe bombers struck Allied airfields. Panzer divisions rolled forward along multiple axes. The French High Command watched the reports flow in with satisfaction. This was what they had expected. Germany was repeating 1914. The northern invasion had begun. Supreme Commander Gamelin issued the order. Plan D was in effect. French and British forces surged forward into Belgium, racing to establish defensive positions along the Deal River before German forces arrived. The Allies were moving exactly as Manstein predicted. Far to the south, in the Ardennes sector, French forces were spread thin. The 2nd and 9th French armies held this quiet sector. Older reservists, second-line units, divisions equipped with older equipment. They weren't expected to do much. The Ardennes would slow any German probe long enough for reinforcements to arrive. On May 10th, those units began reporting something strange. Large-scale German movements in the forest. Not small reconnaissance elements, but entire divisions. The roads were clogged with German vehicles. The sound of engines echoed through the hills. The reports reached Army Group headquarters. Staff officers reviewed them calmly. Yes, some German forces are probing the Ardennes, probably a secondary effort to prevent French reinforcements from moving north. Nothing to be concerned about. The main battle is developing in Belgium, as planned. For 2 days, German forces pushed through the Ardennes. The advance was slower than hoped. Traffic jams did develop, and French engineers had demolished some bridges, but not slow enough. Guderian's panzers maintained momentum. Motorcycle reconnaissance units raced ahead, clearing obstacles. Combat engineers rebuilt bridges under fire. French defenders fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Small units of French cavalry and infantry tried to slow the advance with roadblocks and ambushes. They inflicted casualties, but couldn't stop the armored tide. The Germans simply bypassed strongpoints and kept moving. By May 12th, German forces had emerged from the Ardennes and reached the Meuse River. The impenetrable barrier had been crossed in 48 hours.
The Meuse River at Sedan, a natural defensive line. On the western bank, French fortifications and artillery positions overlooked the Loire. The defenders had expected days to prepare, to bring up reinforcements, to establish interlocking fields of fire. They had hours. On May 13th, German forces began crossing the Meuse at multiple points. The assault combined every element of Blitzkrieg doctrine. Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers attacked French positions in wave after wave, the shrieking sirens psychologically devastating defenders. German artillery pounded crossing points. Assault engineers in rubber boats paddled across under covering fire. French defenders fought hard. Artillery destroyed some crossing attempts. Machine gun fire cut down German soldiers on the exposed river, but the attackers kept coming. More boats, more engineers, more covering fire. By afternoon, German engineers had established pontoon bridges. Tanks began crossing. The French Second Army commander, General Charles Hutziger, received reports of the breakthrough. He ordered counterattacks, but his forces were scattered, his reserves committed to containing other penetrations. The units available were too few, too poorly positioned, moving too slowly. Guderian's panzers didn't wait for the entire division to cross. As soon as enough tanks reached the western bank, they began pushing west, away from the fighting, away from French reinforcements, racing toward open country. This violated every principle of conservative military doctrine. You were supposed to consolidate after a breakthrough, bring up supplies, secure your flanks. Guderian ignored all of it. Speed was more important than security. By the time French commanders realized where the Germans were going, it would be too late to stop them. On May 15th, the French High Command in Paris began receiving fragmentary reports from the Sedan sector. The reports were confused, contradictory. Some units reported German armor advancing west, others claimed containment. Communication was breaking down as German aircraft strafed French command posts and communication centers. Gamelin ordered reserves to move south toward Sedan, but the reserves were far away, committed to the Belgian campaign. Redeploying them would take days. The French military machine, designed for methodical warfare, couldn't react quickly enough. By May 15th, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. German Panzerdivisions had broken through the French front at Sedan and were racing west, virtually unopposed. They were moving 40, 50 miles per day, faster than French commanders could track on maps. Communication with forward units was sporadic or non-existent. Nobody knew exactly where the Germans were, only that they were somewhere behind what had been the front line. The meeting happened in the evening of May 15th. Senior officers of the French General Staff gathered in Paris to assess the situation. Maps were spread on tables. Reports were read. The atmosphere was tense, disbelieving. Someone said it aloud. "The Germans have broken through at Sedan. They've crossed the Meuse. They're advancing toward the Channel." There was silence. Another officer insisted there must be a mistake. German armor couldn't be that far west. The reports had to be exaggerated, confused by the chaos of battle. More reports arrived. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed massive German columns moving west. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing panzers. French units were being bypassed, surrounded, overwhelmed. The Germans had executed what military theorists would later call the greatest strategic maneuver of the war. They had identified France's center of gravity, not the Maginot Line, but the assumption that modern armor couldn't move through the Ardennes. They had struck at that assumption and shattered it. And now French strategy lay in ruins. An officer spoke the words nobody wanted to hear. "The Maginot Line has been flanked. It's no longer relevant to the battle." The Maginot Line, that magnificent fortress chain, the product of a decade of planning and construction, the symbol of French security, was sitting exactly where it had always been, guns pointed toward Germany, soldiers at their posts, perfectly functional and completely useless. The Germans weren't attacking the Maginot Line. They were simply going around it. And once they reached the Channel coast, the line would be cut off, isolated. Its garrison trapped inside their indestructible bunkers, while the real war happened elsewhere. France had spent billions on a fortification designed to fight the last war, and Germany had brought a new kind of war. The next 2 weeks were a military catastrophe beyond anything France had imagined. German panzer divisions reached the English Channel at Abbeville on May 20th, completing the encirclement of Allied forces in Belgium. The French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and Belgian forces were trapped in a pocket along the northern coast. The French government ordered counterattacks to break through the German corridor and restore connection with the trapped armies. These attacks were launched piecemeal, without proper coordination, against German forces who had already consolidated their positions. The counterattacks failed. In Paris, the High Command struggled to comprehend what was happening. The entire French battle plan had collapsed in 10 days. The concept of the continuous front, the foundation of military thinking since 1914, no longer existed. German armor roamed behind French lines, creating chaos, destroying supply depots, cutting communications. French forces fought bravely in local engagements, sometimes achieving tactical victories. But tactical victories meant nothing when the strategic situation was hopeless. The Maginot Line garrison, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers in their underground fortresses, listened to radio reports of the disaster unfolding to their west and north. Their guns remained silent. No German forces approached their sector. They were defending territory that no longer mattered. Some units proposed abandoning the line, marching west to rejoin the fighting. But by the time such orders could be issued and executed, there was nowhere to march to. The battle was over. On June 26th, the British began evacuating their forces from Dunkirk. Over the next 9 days, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers would be rescued from the beaches under German bombardment. A miraculous escape, but also a humiliating defeat. The French government, watching the military collapse, searched desperately for options. Some officials proposed withdrawing to a defensive line along the Somme River. Others advocated forming a Breton redoubt in western France to continue resistance. A few realistic voices admitted that France had already lost. On June 10th, the French government abandoned Paris. The Germans entered the undefended capital 4 days later. On June 22nd, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, now serving as prime minister, requested an armistice from Germany. On June 22nd, in the same railway car where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I, France signed its surrender. The Third French Republic, which had survived 4 years of brutal warfare from 1914 to 1918, had been destroyed in 6 weeks. The Maginot Line never fired a shot in anger at attacking German forces. When the armistice was signed, the garrison of the line surrendered their positions according to the terms of the agreement. German soldiers toured the fortifications with professional admiration, examining the engineering, studying the defensive layouts. They were impressed. The fortifications were indeed formidable, possibly impossible to assault directly. They just hadn't mattered. Years later, military historians would analyze the fall of France, trying to understand how such a catastrophic defeat could happen so quickly. The explanations were complex: flawed doctrine, poor communication, inadequate reserves, political dysfunction. But at the core of the disaster was one simple fact. France had prepared meticulously to fight World War I again. Germany had invented a new kind of warfare. The Maginot Line represented the culmination of defensive military thinking. It embodied everything France had learned from 4 years of trench warfare: that defense dominated offense, that firepower stopped attacks, that fortifications saved lives and won wars. All of that was true in 1918. By 1940, warfare had changed. Tanks, aircraft, radios, and new tactics had created a different battlefield. Speed mattered more than firepower. Maneuver mattered more than position. Disruption mattered more than attrition. The French military establishment had received intelligence about these changes. They had the information. They chose to interpret it through the lens of their experience, their doctrine, their certainty that they understood warfare better than some German theorists. That certainty was their downfall. The moment the French High Command received confirmation that German armor had crossed the Meuse and was advancing west, the moment they understood the Maginot Line had been flanked, was not the moment France lost the battle. That had been determined days earlier, when German columns entered the Ardennes and French commanders dismissed it as a diversion. But it was the moment France understood they had lost. The moment the carefully constructed edifice of French strategic thinking collapsed. The generals who had survived the trenches, who had learned the lessons of the Great War, who had built the most formidable defensive line in history, realized that none of it mattered, because the war they had prepared for was not the war they were fighting. There is a particular kind of horror in watching your worldview disintegrate, in realizing that everything you built, everything you believed, everything you sacrificed for was based on assumptions that were no longer true. That was the French experience in May 1940. The lessons of the Maginot Line extend far beyond military history. France had committed what strategists call fighting the last war, preparing for the conflict you experienced rather than the conflict you might face. It's a natural human tendency. We learn from experience. We apply those lessons to future challenges. Usually, that's wise. But sometimes the future doesn't resemble the past. Sometimes the rules change. Sometimes the tactics that brought victory before bring catastrophe now. Recognizing when paradigms shift is extraordinarily difficult. It requires intellectual flexibility, willingness to question assumptions, openness to uncomfortable truths. Organizations, especially successful organizations, struggle with this. The very expertise that makes you excellent in the current paradigm can blind you to evidence that the paradigm is changing. The French military in 1940 was staffed by intelligent, experienced, dedicated professionals. They weren't incompetent. They weren't cowards. They were experts operating within a framework that had been validated by the greatest war in human history. That expertise became rigidity. That experience became dogma. That validation became certainty. And when the framework collapsed, they had nothing to fall back on. The Germans, by contrast, had lost World War I. They had no investment in proving that the old ways still worked. They were free, perhaps forced, to innovate, to question, to experiment. Their doctrine emerged from necessity and imagination rather than tradition and validation. This is the paradox. Sometimes defeat teaches more than victory. Sometimes the losers learn while the winners ossify. None of this was inevitable. France had the resources, the technology, the manpower to defeat Germany in 1940. What they lacked was the conceptual framework to understand what kind of war they were fighting. The Maginot Line still exists. Sections of it are preserved as historical monuments. Tourists walk through the underground galleries, marveling at the engineering. The fortifications remain impressive, a testament to what France tried to achieve. But they're also a monument to the danger of fighting the wrong war, of building magnificent solutions to problems that no longer exist, of certainty in the face of changing realities. In the spring of 1940, in a series of offices and command posts across France, French generals received reports that shattered their understanding of warfare. The words varied, but the message was always the same. The Germans have broken through. The Maginot Line has been flanked. Everything we planned for has failed. Those were the moments, cold, irrevocable, when France understood that their doctrine, their strategy, their magnificent defensive line had all been made obsolete not by superior German strength, but by superior German thinking. War doesn't stop at walls. It flows around them.